Cold Case Christianity Broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about two common objections that are offered related to the existence of God. So if you're somebody who's making a claim about God's existence, you believe that God does exist, and you maybe talked about it with your friends, you've actually maybe even gotten into dialogues back and forth on social media. That's not unusual on Facebook. You see a lot of people will post something on their Facebook wall or on a Twitter feed or an Instagram, maybe a picture, and get some pushback from people who maybe they didn't realize didn't hold their views related to God's existence. And you may have even had these doubts on your own and wondered how would I ever resolve these, or maybe you don't even think they can be resolved, and that's why you're not a believer. So we're going to talk maybe in the next couple of episodes over the next few weeks about different objections to God's existence. And one of the first ones I want to talk about, and we'll talk about it in broad areas, I want to start with some objections that I've gotten recently related to the book I wrote, God's Crime Scene. Now remember, I've written two books. The first book really looks at the reliability of the New Testament scriptures, the Gospels. And I used a process that I developed as a cold case detective in order to determine if witnesses who came to me on a certain case were reliable eyewitnesses, because I can tell you that there are times when you get fooled, right? And so you have to be careful with your eyewitnesses. And so this process, this template that I use to determine, to mine out the reliability of my eyewitnesses, that was the exact same template that I used as a new believer, as somebody who was investigating the claims of Christianity, because it took me 6 months to transition from my very adamant atheistic position toward even warming up to the idea that the Gospels might include data that was actually true. And then to move beyond that, I had to do the investigation of the supernatural, basically. Why do I think that the miracle portions of the Gospels could be true? That is what I really try to examine in God's Crime Scene when we take a look at whether or not philosophical naturalism can explain the world, the universe that we see, can offer answers for the 8 most important pieces of evidence that are in the room of the natural universe. Now, I've already done a series of that recently here at Cold Case Christianity, and if you're interested in kind of reviewing the data on that, you can go back into our archive on YouTube. You can see our Cold Case Christianity archive, and you can look at those shows that kind of review some of the data in God's Crime Scene. But one of the first things I looked at, both as a skeptic who was examining my own philosophical naturalism and as an author in the book, God's Crime Scene, was several pieces of evidence, right? We talk about this analogy of having a room in which we have a death that occurs. How do we determine if it's a criminal death? Because you could die naturally, accidentally, by suicide, or by murder. And one of the simplest processes we use is to simply ask the question, can I explain everything in the room, everything that I see in the room, all the evidence I see in the room, by staying in the room? If I can, it's not going to be a murder. If I have to go out of the room for an explanation because there's something in the room that was deposited by somebody who was outside the room, now I got to consider the possibility of an intruder. And this is really what shapes the difference between death investigations and crime investigations. So we looked at the same process with the universe. 8 pieces of evidence in the universe. Can I explain these by staying in the room? And one of the first pieces I looked at, the very first piece I looked at in the book, was the room itself. How do we account for the existence of the room? Now, look, I mentioned this because the first objection I want to cover with you is this objection related to, well, if you're offering this, I hear this all the time, and even Dawkins offers this in one of his books. If you're going to posit that there is a God that created the universe, that's the first cause of the universe, you haven't really solved the problem of how the universe came into being, because you still have to explain how this God that created the universe came into being. So you've just nudged the problem back one level. So the first objection I want to handle here is the objection, well, who created God? If you believe there is a God that created everything else, this doesn't solve the problem, Mr. Christian or Mr. Theist. You're going to have to explain who created God. Now, that's an objection that is offered sometimes by people who are really in a position, they really ought to know better, to even ask this kind of question. And Dawkins is one of these. Richard Dawkins is one of the best-known atheists in the world, really. He's British, and so he's written quite a bit against Christianity, against theism. And he offers this objection that we really haven't solved this problem for the caused universe by simply arguing that there's a first cause called God, because then you got to ask the question, well, who caused God? Well, let's deal with this objection in a straightforward manner. I think that this is really comes down to this principle called the principle of causality, which is kind of underlies all scientific explorations. This idea that we believe that anything that begins to exist must have a cause, a beginning cause. Anything that changes over time must have a cause. Anything that's finite must have a cause. Anything that's limited must have a cause. These are principles of causality that really we embrace philosophically before we can even begin to do science, because we're going to run experiments in which we're going to set up a cause and effect relationship. We're going to cause something to happen and see what happens so we can kind of assess what power this cause had, or we can work backwards to see what would cause a certain thing in our environment. These kinds of scientific experiments really depend upon causality in order to make any sense at all. And so these are basic principles that we embrace. And by the way, you embrace these intuitively. Even if you're curious about the nature of quantum physics and what happens at the quantum level, you know in your daily experience that when I have, for example, a pen, and I know that I push the pen, I get a resulting cause. You don't expect, for example, this pen to appear here tomorrow unless somebody puts it here. This is really what we look at in all evidence in crime scenes. One of the first questions we have to ask related to evidence in crime scenes involves origination, causation, and explanation. How did this thing get in the scene? If the thing has been in the scene all along, if it was part of the scene, if the builder of the store where this murder occurred left this item in the scene when he built the store, well, then it precedes both the victim and the suspect, and it really has no evidential value to us. If the thing we're looking at first came into the scene because the victim brought it in with him or her, well, it may have some importance to us, especially if it's touched or moved by a suspect. But if the first time this piece of evidence shows up in this scene is when a suspect enters this scene, now the origination of this piece of evidence is of critical importance to us, and we can ask the question, how did it get here? What caused it to be in this position it's in? And how do we best explain it? These are things we must do with every piece of evidence in a crime scene: origination, causation, explanation. So when we look at these things, the first thing we're going to look at typically in a scene is why this scene? Why did the murder occur here? Well, and looking at the universe and everything in it, the first question I think is reasonable to ask is, how did the universe come into being? Now look, let's go back to this question of, well, we think it's an external cause we call God. But does that cause need an explanation as well? Does God need a cause? Remember, the principle of causality doesn't say that everything has a cause. It simply says that those things that begin, that change, that are finite and limited, these are the things that have causes. The classic notion of God is that He is the uncaused creative force of everything we see. He's the uncreated creator. That is the definition, the classic definition we offer as theists. In other words, His uncaused nature is part of His definition. So to ask the question, well, who created the uncreated creator, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, since the idea of Him being uncreated is part of his very core, His very definition. He is by definition the uncreated creator. So the question itself seems to me to be a little bit misplaced, right? In the sense that it doesn't really help us to ask a question that's nonsensical from the beginning. Now you might be saying, well, wait a minute, no, Jim, that doesn't really seem fair. You seem like you're just kind of borrowing an ad hoc characteristic, uncreatedness, in order to explain this crazy thing you call God. But let me just remind you of something. All of us, regardless of our worldview, whether we are theists or atheists, we all believe that there is an uncreated, uncaused, eternal first cause of the universe. I'm not the only one who posits that as a theist. As a matter of fact, even as an atheist, I believe there was an uncaused first cause, an eternal something that causes the universe to come into existence. This is not unusual. The atheists that I read, the cosmologists, the physicists, they all posit some kind of an environment, which by itself is kind of borrowing from the language. Because remember, if all space, time, and matter, the stuff of the universe, space, time, and matter, comes into existence from nothing, and the science demonstrates that is the case. I make that case in the very first chapter of God's Crime Scene. All space, time, and matter comes into existence from nothing according to all the evidential scientific data we have today. Everything points to something we call the standard cosmological model. Sometimes it's called Big Bang Theory, the idea that everything leaps into existence from nothing. And the cosmologists that already embraced this form of cosmology, standard cosmological model, they would argue that whatever brings this into existence itself cannot be spatial, temporal, or material, because let's face it, those are the things that come into existence. So what precedes all of this? What is the definition of nothing? Now, those people that I'm reading are arguing maybe it's a multiverse generator of some sort, some kind of quantum vacuum environment, but then again, what would that be made up of? It can't be spatial, temporal, or material. That's the problem with these theories. But back up for a second. Regardless of who you are arguing for some kind of eternal environment or cause that could cause all space, time, and matter to leap into existence. We're all in the same boat, it turns out. It's not just a question you can ask, well, who caused your God? Who created God? Well, no, by definition, our God is by definition uncreated. But hold on a second, Mr. Atheist. Your first cause, by your own definition, is also uncreated. So we're all positing some kind of an environment, a quantum vacuum in which these bubble universes emerge, or it's some kind of multiverse generator of some nature that's undescribed. But whatever it is we're describing from the atheist side, it's also eternal and uncaused. Now, if that's the case, the only thing that separates their two explanations, the explanation of the theist and the explanation of the atheist, is whether or not the eternal, uncaused first cause that is non-spatial, non-temporal, atemporal, and non-material is personal or impersonal. That's really all that's left to argue about. If it's an impersonal set of forces, well, it would defy any kind of science we have access to, because we typically work in the realm of space, time, and matter. And this thing we're looking at would not be spatial, temporal, or material. But whatever this cause is, it's in some kind of impersonal set of forces, or it's a personal being. Those are the only things left on the table. The idea that one of us believes in something that requires a cause and the other one doesn't. No, we both believe in something that's eternal and uncaused. The only question is whether it's personal or not. And my argument would simply be that your impersonal set of forces, whatever you can imagine those to be, and there is no evidence those even exist, but if you can imagine some scenario, could your impersonal set of forces give you the stuff of personhood that we experience in our universe? We experience transcendent personal obligations of transcendent objective moral truths. We experience consciousness. We experience mind, things that are typically associated with personhood. If there's a personal uncaused first cause that creates everything in its image, beings in its image like you and I, well then we could actually account for the things we describe as personhood, personal obligations, moral obligations, personal characteristics like free agency, consciousness, mind. These things become understandable and expected if there's a personal uncaused first cause that causes everything, rather than if there's some kind of quantum generator. Your quantum generator, if it even existed, you could argue it could get you the universe, but it can't get you the stuff in the universe, and that's the problem. So in the end, that's how I would answer, in long form, this objection that, well, who created God? Number one, the question is nonsensical. And number two, we all accept that there's something eternal and uncreated. The only thing left is whether or not that thing is personal. We'll take a quick break, come back, and I'll answer another objection that I see coming after having written God's Crime Scene.
In addition to Jim's daily blog and weekly podcasts and videos, Jim continues to write books designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. These resources will help you defend what you believe and share it with others.
Okay, I want to answer an objection that I get that's really much more difficult to answer, and we're going to answer it in less time because we're going to take just a small piece of it. And it's the problem of evil objection. This is pretty common, right? How can an all-loving, all-powerful God allow evil to occur? And of course the question is, if he's all-powerful, he could stop evil, couldn't he? And if he's not stopping it, maybe he's not all-powerful. Maybe he doesn't want to stop it. Well, if that's the case, he's not all-loving. So which is it? Is he just not all-loving? Or is he not all that powerful? Or does he just not exist at all? That would explain why we have evil in the world. And certainly we see evil, don't we? All the time. Now, I want to limit this discussion today, though, because I've written an entire chapter. It's the last chapter of the book where we talk about the problem of evil. Evil is a piece of evidence that's in the universe that we must explain. And there's inculpating evidences that point towards suspects and exculpating evidences that get those suspects off the hook. So my question here would just be, is evil an inculpating a piece of evidence that actually points to God, or is it an exculpating piece of evidence that points away from God, that really is kind of like an alibi? It disqualifies God altogether as the cause for all the evidence we see in the universe. And I think in the end it's an inculpating piece of evidence, but we'll get to that in a second. The first thing I want to address, though, is something that is commonly asked of me because I work homicides. I'm constantly working cases in which people do great, horrific evil to other victims. And you see it all the time. I can't even begin to tell you the kinds of environments I've been in and the kinds of crimes I've dealt with and the kinds of suspects I've interviewed and the kinds of things they've done. I'm never shocked anymore by how much evil can be caused by humans. And you might think, well, why would God allow humans to do this to other humans? Now, that's one piece of the puzzle of evil that I do want to address with you today, because sometimes that is the primary form of evil that we see. Now, there's other forms of evil, and I'll tell you this. I've written an entire section about this at the coldcasechristianity.com website. So if you go there, and under the Writings tab, you just tab down, you'll see that it'll drop down, have a drop-down menu. There's a section there just on the problem of evil. And I think this is something that you can't really talk about in the 10 minutes we're going to take today. But I think the problem of moral evil, the actions done by humans against other humans, that is something we can address today. Because I think in the end, that is a big chunk of what we see as the problem of evil. Now, I will say one thing to you. I do think that the answer to the problem of evil is just like the answer to any act of evil that I work as a detective. There's never one cause, one reason why a crime occurs. This complex set of conditions that have to be in place just so that poor child was kidnapped on that day, or that crime occurred on that day. It has to be just so. I've actually followed guys around as a surveillance officer and watched them do crimes before I took them to jail for doing crimes. And I can tell you, we weren't quite sure that was the suspect. Once we saw him do a crime, we knew we had the right guy. We took him to jail. But we would watch that guy for 2 weeks, and he wouldn't do anything out of the ordinary, and we'd think, well, gosh, maybe he's not our guy. And then just the right set of conditions would come together in his life that he would actually go out that day and find the right place that happened to be the right location and had the right number of people in the business before he did the robbery, and everything was just so. And so he decided to do a crime that day. Luckily, we were there to see it. Now, I can tell you that when you watch those things come together, you realize that the puzzle pieces that have to be in place to explain any act of evil or any crime are very complex. And so for us to be able to answer the problem of evil with a quick 10-minute solution is probably not going to happen, because I think there are many conditions. I actually offer 7 in God's crime scene, 7 factors that I think God would have to have in mind in order to allow any act to occur, let alone evil. And if you think the mind of my suspects is complex, imagine trying to get out and dig through and investigate the mind of God. So I think that the problem is always more difficult than we give it on paper, that we write about in books. It's a much more complicated, cumulative case. Like almost everything I do is cumulative case. So I just want to offer that as a qualification before we start talking about the problem of moral evil. Now let me just dive in. When I think about what's foundational as an atheist, the thing that I valued the most in my universe was, and I would have said is the highest virtue, the highest moral value, would be love. The idea that we could love others, it seemed to me to be the goal we ought to be striving for, because it seemed to be the highest moral value, is to love one another. And we see this also on the pages of Scripture. Love the Lord your God and love others like you love yourself. This idea of love is central. It's a high moral virtue, a high moral claim. But if you're going to offer that there's two kinds of possible universes, a universe or two kinds of possible gods. If we said, how about a God who would create a universe in which love is possible? Or a God that would create a universe in which love is not possible. I think even me as an atheist, I would have said, if there is a God, the good God, the moral God, the loving God creates a universe in which love is possible. To create a universe in which love is impossible, no good God would do that. Well, there's the rub, if you ask me, because in order to be the good God that we all would hope there would be, the one that the critic objects, there is no good God if it allows evil, if it allows people, if this God would allow people to do this kind of harm to one another. Well, here's the problem. If you want to create a universe in which love, this thing we all hold and cherish as the highest virtue, if you want a universe in which love is possible, you have to go one level below that and create a universe in which freedom, free agency, free choices are possible. You can't have a universe in which love exists if you're going to compel everyone to behave a certain way. You're going to have to open up the floodgates, open up the free agency of humans to allow them to freely choose to love if you want love to be genuine. Love can't be compelled. Love that is forced is not love. I can't go to my kids and say, you will love me. I can say it, but they're not going to necessarily love me. And if they said, okay, I love you, it wouldn't be genuine. They have to freely choose that in order for it to be genuine. Oh, really? You create that kind of universe, that's a dangerous kind of universe, because that kind of universe allows people to do just the opposite. If you're going to give me the freedom to love, you better also give me the freedom to hate, or it's not true freedom. If you're going to cut off every hateful thought, cut off every hateful act, you just made me you just limited me. I have no choice but to act a certain way. You've limited my freedom, and now love is not genuine. Love is not true. This is the double-edged kind of dangerous sword that free agency is. It's a double-edged knife, right? And you have to learn how to catch it. Now, I think an unloving God would be the kind of God that would give you freedoms, give you moral freedom, give you freedom of choice, yet give you no guidance, no instruction set, he basically would throw a knife at you and not teach you how to catch it. That's not the kind of God that we worship as Christians. We've got a God that's giving you the kind of crazy free agency which makes love possible, and then has given us a set of principles that we can follow so as not to abuse that free agency, to actually live a certain way, that we don't abuse the freedom we've been given. Now, many of us will ignore those guidelines, right? We'll just deny they exist. We won't be interested in them. And sure enough, if we do that, then, get ready. We're going to have some problems. But it's not as though our God has kind of given us this freedom and no guidance. No, God has given us this freedom and a very strict guidance in terms of how we can use it properly. And we have to decide if we want to accept that guidance or not. And then if we don't accept it, it's not on us. On God, rather. It's on us. Because we've just chosen to ignore the guidelines that God has given us. So I think this idea, it is a dangerous idea. Now, and if all there is this life, then I think it can be abused. Your freedoms can be abused. But if our lives really extend beyond the grave and we are to live eternally with God, if we will be with God in heaven forever, and that is the true nature of our existence, the true nature of our lives, then the kind of evil we would suffer in the first millisecond we call our 90 years on planet Earth, which actually becomes less and less of a millisecond as life stretches out in eternity, then I think we have to weigh all evil in light of eternity and recognize that by giving you the freedom to love, you have a responsibility with that freedom, and not everyone's going to embrace it. And that is why I think we have a world that can be dangerous. And love really is dangerous. The ability to love is dangerous. We need to take it seriously because it requires a certain amount of responsible free agency. And not everybody is going to be responsible. Now, I think this explains why people do the kinds of things they do. But of course, more robustly, I think the other 6 factors that I see that you might have to consider in order for any act of evil to be explained, we haven't covered at all. And this, by the way, is why I don't do this on Twitter. Now, let me say one last thing. if we're calling something evil, it seems to me that we're calling it evil not because it's our opinion. It's our opinion that it's evil. It's our just our little view that it's evil. We really think it's evil. We think that this thing should not have happened. We think that it's evil no matter who you are. It's a transcendent, it's truly evil, not just a matter of our private fancies, as C.S. Lewis would say, and it's not just a matter of our personal opinion. We think some things are truly evil, regardless of who you are, that they transcend all of us, certain forms of evil. Really? Well, on what basis could we say something is evil to begin with? On what standard? C.S. Lewis puts it this way, you don't know what a crooked line is until you can have a straight line to compare it to. If we think there are things that we would say are transcendently evil, we'd have to admit then that there is something we would say is a standard of transcendent good by which we measure and then call something evil. So the fact that you could call the existence of evil out as a piece of evidence in this crime scene indicates there must be a transcendent object of good, a standard by which you measure, and then you would say this doesn't measure up. This, according to that, is evil. The problem is you have to have a that to be an according to that, and that's the problem. I actually think the existence of evil is yet another piece of inculpating evidence requiring the existence of a transcendent source, a standard of good by which we could measure anything we choose to call evil. And that's the other problem you have with calling evil out as if it is not a piece of evidence that we have to account for that actually does, I think, point back to the same source that also is the cause of the universe. So when we look at this, I think in the end that evil does end up being in the inculpating category rather than in the exculpating category. So there you go. 2 objections, common objections offered against the existence of God. And I hope I've helped you to kind of move forward a little bit. And remember, those explanations take a little time to parse out. That's why I don't do it in 140 characters on Twitter. And that's why I typically won't do it with people who aren't willing to take the time to kind of be face to face and hear me out. And this is why I think it's important for us to take time with our friends and family to help them work through those objections. Okay, that's it for this week. I'll see you right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.
This program was made possible through your generous donations to NRB TV.
Hi, I'm Kirk Cameron.
And I'm Ray Comfort.
And we're really excited to let you know that an entirely new season of The Way of the Master has finally arrived. The Way of the Master, Mission Europe. Ray and the team traveled to 13 countries in 13 days, preaching the gospel to people from many different cultures.
Are you a good person?
That's the way.